In the days following the Normandy landings, June 1944, small American intelligence teams are working their way through the Norman countryside. They are attached to divisions and corps spread across the bridgehead, and most of them are not soldiers in any conventional sense. They are interrogators, trained at a secret facility in the mountains of Maryland, and they carry with them a battered War Department publication called Order of Battle of the German Army. It tells them, in organized and continuously updated detail, the structure of the army they have come to fight. One of them is Werner Angres. He was born in Berlin. He fled Germany in 1937 and eventually found his way to the United States. Now he is in Normandy, attached to an American airborne division, interviewing captured Germans in their own language. A prisoner reluctantly describes a minefield his unit has planted. Angres persuades the man to draw its boundaries on a map, then sends the prisoner across the marked safe lane first, to verify it. The American soldiers who follow survive because of what that man could read, in a document, in a language, and in the uniform across the table from him. Another Ritchie boy, Guy Stern, born in Hildesheim, Germany, arrives by ship on June 9th and begins interrogating prisoners almost immediately upon reaching shore. He does not wait to be settled, to be assigned a fixed post, to complete any more paperwork. He begins reading the men in front of him. Neither of these men needed a prisoner to volunteer anything. They could already read the uniform. The collar tab told them the branch. The sleeve told them the unit. The small booklet in the tunic pocket told them the regiment, the battalion, and where that soldier had been for the past several years. The Germans had no way to stop them, and this is the story of why. This is the story of one of the most underappreciated intelligence advantages of the entire Second World War. It is the story of how the United States Army built a system for reading the enemy from the clothes on a prisoner's back, the booklet in his pocket, and the color of the piping on his collar. It is the story of order of battle intelligence, of the men who mastered it, and of why German commanders, no matter how many orders they issued, could never make their units invisible to Americans who had been trained to see exactly what was there. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what a military commander actually needs to know. The question that sits at the top of every operational decision is not how many of the enemy there are, or even where they are in the broadest sense. The real question is this: who am I fighting? Not the enemy in general, specifically. Which division is holding that ridge? Which corps controls this sector? Is this a fresh formation brought in from reserve, or a formation that has been fighting continuously for 6 months and is down to a fraction of its paper strength? Is it infantry or armor, elite or second-rate? A unit that will fight to the last position or one that will break under a hard assault from the flank? The answers to those questions are what military professionals call the order of battle. It is the foundation on which every operational plan is built. A division commander who knows he faces a depleted Volksgrenadier division scraped together from recovering wounded and teenagers plans his attack differently from one who believes he faces a fresh Panzer division at full strength. An army planner who understands that a German corps facing him has just been transferred from the Eastern Front, where it fought in open terrain, and is now compressed into the hedgerows of Normandy, has a genuine insight into how that corps will behave under pressure. The difference between an accurate order of battle picture and an inaccurate one is not a paperwork problem. It is often the difference between a plan that works and one that fails at a cost of thousands of lives. The Germans understood this perfectly. The British had understood it since at least the First World War, and by 1942, the Americans were building something that would prove more effective at the tactical level than anything their opponents had anticipated. Here is something that is easy to miss when thinking about the German military machine of the Second World War. For all its reputation for operational security, the Wehrmacht went to war, carrying an extraordinary amount of unit identification on the bodies of its soldiers. This was not a mistake. It was deliberate, and it made sense from the inside. The German army was an enormous organism. By 1943, it had hundreds of divisions deployed across thousands of kilometers of front, from the Arctic Circle to Egypt, from the Atlantic coast of France to the outskirts of Leningrad. Keeping that organism functioning required that soldiers, officers, and administrators could quickly identify who belonged to what. Collar insignia, shoulder boards, embroidered sleeve bands, vehicle markings, all of these served real internal management purposes. They allowed commanders to instantly identify formations in the chaos of mobile warfare. They allowed the administrative machine to know where to send pay, equipment, and replacement drafts. German soldiers wore what were called Waffenfarben, branch of service colours, woven as piping into collar tabs and shoulder straps. Infantry wore white. Panzer troops wore a distinctive rose pink, a colour that traced back to the Reichswehr's interwar motor transport branch, which had quietly nursed Germany's earliest tank doctrine during the years when open rearmament was prohibited. Artillery wore red, signals wore lemon yellow, pioneers wore black, armoured reconnaissance units within panzer divisions wore golden yellow. At a glance, a trained observer could place any German soldier in a branch before he said a word. For an American intelligence officer who had spent 8 weeks at a dedicated training school studying these systems, a prisoner's collar tab was not cloth. It was a data point. But the system ran much deeper than colour. Many German formations wore embroidered cuff titles, bands of cloth stitched to the lower left sleeve of the tunic that identified the wearer by the name of his specific unit. The Grossdeutschland division wore a cuff title that said exactly that, Grossdeutschland, in Gothic lettering, visible to anyone standing within a few feet. The Waffen-SS divisions wore theirs with equal pride. The Leibstandarte S. Adolf Hitler, wore its full name on the sleeve. Das Reich wore the words Das Reich. Totenkopf wore the name that translated as Death's Head. These were marks of elite status, politically significant within the Nazi system, and deeply embedded in the culture of those formations. They were not incidental decoration. They were institutional identity. Removing them felt, to the men who wore them, like an erasure of everything their unit represented. That tension between unit pride and security discipline would become one of the persistent failures of German operational security throughout the campaign. Vehicle markings added another layer. German armoured and motorised units painted tactical symbols on their vehicles, numbers and geometric shapes that identified regiment, battalion, and company within a division. Many divisions used distinctive emblems. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend used a combination of a sig rune and a key, the key element inherited from the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, which had provided the founding cadre of the division. Knocked-out German vehicles on the roadside were intelligence sources. Aerial photographs of German positions could sometimes confirm divisional identity from vehicle markings alone, before a single prisoner was taken. Then there was the Soldbuch. Every German soldier was required by military regulation to carry this document at all times, in a designated inside pocket of his tunic. Leaving it behind in barracks was a punishable violation. Unauthorized alteration of its contents was a criminal offense. The Soldbuch was simultaneously a paybook, an identification document, a complete medical record, and a unit history for the individual soldier. It contained the man's name, rank, blood type, home address, physical description, inoculation record, wound history, decorations received, and equipment issued. From late 1943 onward, following an order issued in November of that year, photographs were progressively added, with full rollout to combat units required by the end of 1944. Most critically for Allied intelligence, the Soldbuch contained the man's complete record of every unit assignment since the day he was inducted. Every transfer, every reassignment, every attachment to a different formation, all of it recorded in sequential order. American analysts described it at the time as the most important personal document carried by German soldiers, and one of the most valuable of all documentary sources of intelligence. That was not an exaggeration. A single Soldbuch, taken from a prisoner captured in Normandy, might reveal that the man had served on the Eastern Front before being transferred to France, that his division had been rebuilt after being shattered in Russia, and that it had been at its current location for less than 2 weeks. None of that required the prisoner to say a word. It was all on the pages. The German postal system added one more strand. Every German unit had a Feldpost number, a field post number that functioned as a postal identifier for military mail. Letters and postcards found on prisoners or recovered from the battlefield carried these numbers. A single envelope, cross-referenced against the accumulated order of battle database, could confirm a unit's presence in a sector and sometimes help pin down its location within a few kilometers. A letter not yet sent, found in a dead soldier's pocket, carried the same information. Intelligence personnel were trained to collect everything. Consider what this all meant in practical terms. A prisoner brought in after a firefight might refuse to say a single word beyond his name. He might maintain that discipline throughout a long interrogation. And yet within an hour of his capture, an experienced American intelligence team might already know his division, his regiment, his battalion, approximately when his unit arrived at its current position, where it had been before, and how many other formations were operating on its flanks. They knew this from his collar tab, his sleeve, the number on his shoulder strap, his Soldbuch, and the letters in his pocket. His silence was not protecting very much. The German army, in other words, was a system that identified itself continuously through multiple overlapping channels to anyone who had taken the time to learn how to read it. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, it confronted a difficult truth. The American military had spent the interwar decades in a state of radical reduction. By the mid-1930s, the regular army numbered roughly 130,000 to 140,000 men, placing the United States between 17th and 18th in the world in active military strength, behind Portugal. The army that had fought in France in 1917 and 1918 had numbered in the millions. By the 1930s, it had been cut to a peacetime shadow, and most of its institutional knowledge had been allowed to disappear with it. The ability to systematically collect, analyze, and exploit information about enemy order of battle had existed in limited form during the First World War. In the years between the wars, without funding, without a school, and without institutional priority, it atrophied to almost nothing. There was no standardized doctrine for interrogating prisoners. There was no centralized reference system for tracking enemy formations. There was no school that trained people to do any of it. American division intelligence officers were largely working from first principles, often without formal training in the discipline they were supposed to practice. The gap between what American military intelligence could do in 1941 and what it would need to do in Europe was not a small one. It was a chasm. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, understood this was a genuine operational problem. If American troops were going to fight in Europe against a German army that had been at war for 3 years and had fought on multiple fronts, they needed people who could tell commanders what they were actually facing. In the spring of 1941, more than 6 months before Pearl Harbor, Marshall dispatched American officers to Britain to study how the British military handled intelligence training. They returned with a clear recommendation. The United States needed a centralized military intelligence training school, and it needed to open immediately. Secretary of War Henry Stimson approved the plan on May 26, 1942. The school opened roughly 3 weeks later. Tucked into the South Mountain Range of western Maryland, part of the northern extension of the Blue Ridge Physiographic Province, roughly 70 miles northwest of Washington, sits a place called Camp Ritchie. It had been a Maryland National Guard summer training facility since 1926, named after Governor Albert C. Ritchie. The terrain was suitable for the purpose. Mountains, forests, open ground for exercises, and enough isolation from population centers to maintain the secrecy the mission required. On June 19, 1942, the Military Intelligence Training Center opened at Camp Ritchie. It was the first centralized military intelligence school in American history. Its curriculum was built from scratch, shaped heavily by British liaison officers, most prominently British Colonel Thomas Robbins, who helped organize instruction in the school's first months and brought with him the methods developed by the British Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center. The training evolved continuously throughout the war, updated as instructors returned from operations in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and eventually France. The training was organized in 8-week courses, with specialty extensions for particular disciplines. 31 successive classes passed through before the school closed in October 1945. Students learned prisoner of war interrogation, aerial photography interpretation, map reading, terrain analysis, signals intelligence, the exploitation of captured documents, and the order of battle methodology itself. The school had full-scale models of German and Japanese armored vehicles and tanks for recognition training. Students ran through field exercises in a mock German village built on the camp grounds, complete with German language signs and simulated military scenarios. Instructors dressed in Wehrmacht uniforms walked students through realistic identification exercises, teaching the Waffenfarb colors, the cuff title system, the shoulder board numbering, the Soldbuch layout, and the divisional emblem schemes used on German vehicles. Teaching methods drew on everything available. Actual captured documents, when they could be obtained, were used in classroom exercises. Reports from intelligence officers already deployed in combat theatres were incorporated into the curriculum as they arrived, ensuring that what was being taught reflected the actual conditions students would encounter. The school was not teaching abstraction, it was teaching a specific, practical skill set aimed at a specific enemy in a specific war. The detail was thorough enough that nearby Maryland farmers, hearing German commands and military sounds drifting from the facility, reportedly concluded that Germany had somehow invaded Washington County. The reference document, anchoring all of this to the battlefield, was the War Department's Order of Battle of the German Army, first issued in April 1943 by the Military Intelligence Service, revised in February 1944, and again in March 1945. It catalogued every identified German division, its history, its assigned corps, its geographic area of operations, and its commanding officers. It was a living document, updated constantly as new prisoners were interrogated, new documents captured, and new aerial reconnaissance interpreted. Every revision was the direct product of the skills being taught at Camp Ritchie. By October 1945, roughly 19,000 military intelligence specialists had passed through the school across those 31 sessions. They came from across the American Army and from allied nations. But within that 19,000, one group stands out in ways that no curriculum could fully explain or replicate. Among the Camp Ritchie graduates were approximately 2,000 to 2,800 German and Austrian Jewish refugees, men who had fled Nazi persecution in the 1930s, rebuilt their lives in the United States, and then, when America entered the war, volunteered or were drafted into the army. Many were identified for intelligence roles because of their language fluency. All of them brought something no training program could manufacture. They knew Germany from the inside. They knew the culture and the psychology of the people they would be interrogating. They knew the class dynamics, the regional accents, the generational attitudes, the specific ways in which a German non-commissioned officer from a Bavarian working-class background would respond differently to questioning than an officer from a Prussian aristocratic family. They had grown up speaking German not as a learned language but as their first. They had attended German schools, lived in German cities, and understood the institutional habits of the German military, because those habits were part of the same society that had shaped them. When they sat across from a German prisoner, they were talking to someone from a world they had once inhabited themselves. They came to be known as the Ritchie Boys. They were not a separate combat unit. They were deployed as small intelligence teams, typically 6 men, embedded in regular American formations across the entire Western Front, from Normandy to the Rhine. They interrogated prisoners in the field, processed captured documents, tracked unit movements, and fed intelligence reports up chains of command that shaped the decisions of generals. Their work covered every category of tactical intelligence that a division or corps commander needed. Where are the enemy's machine gun positions? Where is the minefield boundary? Which units are on the flanks of the formation in front of us? What is the morale of the soldiers we are about to fight? Are they the remnant of a formation destroyed in Russia and fighting out of desperation? Or are they young and well-equipped and ready? The Ritchie Boys were not the only source. Aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, captured maps, and the broader intelligence network all fed the picture. But they were the most consistent and most immediate source of tactical-level information, because prisoners were taken in every engagement, documents were recovered in every advance, and the intelligence teams were always there to process what had been found. They moved with the units they supported, from one engagement to the next, accumulating a picture of the German order of battle that grew more detailed and more reliable with every passing week. A classified post-war American Army assessment credited Ritchie Boy interrogators with approximately 60% of actionable battlefield intelligence gathered in Europe during the war. Historians have noted carefully that this figure almost certainly overstates their share of total Allied intelligence, because the commanders surveyed had no knowledge of Ultra, the British signals intelligence program that had been reading high-level German communications encrypted with the Enigma machine. Since those commanders did not know Ultra existed, they could not account for its contribution. But the 60% accurately reflects what was visible and usable at the tactical level, and at that level it represents something genuine and documented. The personal stakes for these men were not abstract. On December 17, 1944, during the opening days of the German Ardennes offensive, Staff Sergeant Kurt Jacobs and Technician 5th Grade Murray Zappler were serving with interrogator of Prisoner of War Team 154, attached to the 106th Infantry Division. Both were Jewish refugees who had been born in Germany. During the confusion of the German breakthrough, they were captured by soldiers of the 293rd Regiment of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division. The German captain in command, Hauptmann Kurt Bruns, learned that the two men had interrogated German prisoners earlier that same day, in German. He learned they were German Jews. He ordered them taken aside and shot. They were killed in the snow near Blealf, Germany. Bruns was later captured, tried by an American military commission, and executed by firing squad on June 14, 1945, and the first German war criminal to be executed by the United States Army after the surrender. The other Ritchie Boys kept working. They were present through the Normandy breakout, through the fighting across France, through the Hurtgen Forest, through the rest of the Battle of the Bulge, across the Rhine, and eventually at the liberation of concentration camps in the spring of 1945. For some of them, those camps contained family members they had last seen years before in Germany. The personal dimension of what they were doing had no equivalent in any other part of the American army. Most of them went home after the war and said almost nothing about their service for decades. The work was classified. The story of Camp Ritchie and the intelligence system it built remained largely unknown until the 1990s, when declassification began to open the record. The mechanics of the system itself deserve a close look, because this is where the story becomes most concrete. When a German prisoner was taken, the process that followed was methodical and immediate. Military police or intelligence personnel with the capturing unit searched the prisoner at the point of capture. Everything on his body was catalogued before anything was changed or removed. Collar tabs, shoulder boards, cuff titles, Waffenfarb piping, shoulder strap numbers, any correspondence carrying Feldpostnummern, all of it was recorded. Securing the Soldbuch was the first priority. A trained American intelligence officer reading a German prisoner's collar tab knew the branch at a glance from the color of its piping. And if the man wore a cuff title on his lower left sleeve, that alone could identify his division before a single question was asked. Leibstandarte, SS, Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, Großdeutschland. These were not subtle markings. They were embroidered labels worn by soldiers who were proud of them, and any intelligence officer who had spent time at Camp Ritchie recognized them instantly. The Soldbuch filled in what the uniform left open. For an interrogator who had already identified the division, the Soldbuch provided the regiment and the battalion below it. The document's record of previous transfers was sometimes the most valuable element of all. A soldier whose Soldbuch showed he had recently been transferred from the Eastern Front to a division now deployed in France told a story beyond his personal identity. It told something about that division's recent history, about where it had been reconstituted or refitted, and sometimes about the broader strategic situation that had made his transfer necessary. The interrogation itself was the final layer. Prisoners were trained to say nothing. Many said nothing, or tried to. But a prepared interrogator did not need a prisoner to cooperate. He was already working from a substantial base of information assembled from the uniform, the documents, and the accumulated intelligence picture of what units were known to be present in this sector. He could ask targeted questions whose answers, whether the prisoner meant to give them or not, confirmed or contradicted what was already known. A prisoner who insisted his unit was somewhere it was not, while his Soldbuch and collar tab pointed elsewhere, was providing information about his unit's recent reorganization, whether he intended to or not. Cross-referencing multiple prisoners from the same action amplified everything. Several prisoners wearing the same cuff title, all carrying Soldbucher from the same regiment, taken from the same stretch of road, told a coherent and verifiable story. That story went up the intelligence chain, compared against aerial photographs of German positions, checked against signals intercepts, verified against previously captured documents, and refined into an intelligence product that could reach a corps or army headquarters within hours of the prisoners being taken. This process happened not once or twice, but continuously, at every level of the American army, across the entire Western Front, from the Normandy breakout through the final advance into Germany. At every engagement, at every river crossing, at every defensive line, trained intelligence teams were processing prisoners and building the picture. A senior intelligence officer at corps or army level maintaining the order of battle situation map was receiving inputs from dozens of these small team operations simultaneously, comparing them against each other and against every other available source, and producing an increasingly accurate and current picture of which German formations were deployed where, at what strength, and with what probable intentions. When a new unit appeared in a sector, the intelligence picture registered it. When a unit disappeared, that registered too. When a veteran division was replaced by a composite battle group that told American commanders something significant about the state of the German forces on that sector of the front, when a well-known elite formation was identified moving from one area to another, that was a warning sign. The order of battle picture was not a static document. It was a continuously updated map of what the enemy had and where he had it, and it was built piece by piece from the small daily work of reading prisoners, uniforms, and documents. The whole system worked because of the density of the German army's own self-identification. Every German soldier was, in effect, carrying his unit's identity sewn into his clothing and recorded in his pocket. The Americans had spent 3 years learning to read it. Now, the obvious question. German commanders were not oblivious to this problem. Fremde Heer West, the department within the German Army High Command's General Staff, responsible for analyzing Allied forces in the West, understood precisely how prisoner interrogation and uniform exploitation worked. German soldiers were trained to provide only name, rank, and serial number. German commanders issued orders against visible unit markings. German doctrine addressed the security problem explicitly. So why it was never solved? The answer involves 4 separate forces that reinforced each other. First, the conflict between operational necessity and security was never durably resolved. Unit markings existed because they served real functional purposes within the German command system. Removing them created confusion that impaired the Wehrmacht's own ability to operate. In the spring of 1943, responding to evidence that Soviet intelligence on the Eastern Front was exploiting German vehicle insignia for order of battle analysis, Army Group Center issued an order requiring the immediate removal of all unit identification markings from vehicles. The order was seriously intended. It was rescinded within weeks, under the pressure of practical command and control problems that the removal had created. The same pattern repeated itself in different forms across different sectors throughout the war. Orders went out. Practical necessity pushed back. Markings reappeared. The machine could not function without its labels, and it could not keep its labels invisible to a trained adversary. Second, the Soldbuch problem was structurally unsolvable. German soldiers were legally required to carry it at all times. It was how the German military administered pay, tracked personnel, recorded wounds and decorations, and managed the personnel system of an army numbering in the millions. Ordering soldiers not to carry it would have generated administrative paralysis that the fighting force could not sustain. The requirement remained in place throughout the war, and every captured Soldbuch remained a detailed intelligence record delivered directly into Allied hands. Third, unit identity within elite formations carried ideological weight that made suppression politically intractable. For the Waffen-SS divisions, the cuff title on the lower left sleeve was a mark of distinction within the Nazi system, cultivated deliberately as a motivational and propaganda tool. Ordering the Leibstandarte or Das Reich to remove the embroidered words from their sleeves conflicted directly with the way the regime had built those formations, and with the self-image the men inside them had been encouraged to develop. In practice, SS formations retained their identifying markings far more consistently than any security calculation would have justified, because their institutional culture was built on the very pride those markings represented. Fourth, German intelligence consistently underestimated how sophisticated the American tactical intelligence apparatus had become. In 1942, when the Americans were still building from nothing, this underestimation was fair. By 1944, the system had been running for 2 years and had been refined through combat in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France. But Fremde Heer West's picture of American capabilities at the tactical level lagged behind reality. By the time the Germans fully understood what they were facing, the war was already in its terminal phase, and nothing practical could be done about it. Operation Greif is a case study in what German intelligence security failure looked like at its worst. In October 1944, Hitler tasked SS Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny with forming a brigade of German soldiers dressed in American uniforms, riding captured American vehicles to cross Allied lines, seize bridges over the Meuse River, and create confusion in Allied rear areas. Skorzeny had become one of Hitler's preferred unconventional operators after leading the rescue of Benito Mussolini from Italian captivity in September 1943. To find volunteers, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht issued a written order on October 25, 1944, requesting soldiers with knowledge of the English language and specifically the American dialect. This order was distributed in writing to every corps, every army, and every army group headquarters on the Western Front. The information that Germany was recruiting English-speaking volunteers for a special mission in what could only be American uniforms was, in effect, broadcast across the entire German command structure facing the Americans. Allied intelligence picked it up within weeks. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was aware by late November that something involving American uniforms was being planned. Skorzeny reportedly requested permission to cancel the operation on security grounds. Hitler refused. The operation launched in December 1944 alongside the Ardennes offensive and largely failed to achieve its primary objectives. The bridge seizures never happened. Small teams of German soldiers in American uniforms crossed Allied lines and caused real disruption by changing road signs and cutting communications lines. 3 men, Wilhelm Schmidt, Manfred Pernes, and Gunther Billing, were captured in American uniforms near Eiweil on December 17. They were tried by American Military Commission 4 days later and executed by firing squad on December 23, 1944. Their capture triggered a massive Allied security response, temporarily confining General Eisenhower to his headquarters at Versailles while the scope of the operation was assessed. The episode demonstrated in precise terms the asymmetry that had developed. The Americans had spent years building the capability to read German uniforms. The Germans' attempt to use American uniforms had been compromised before it launched by a security failure that telegraphed the entire concept to the enemy. The Ghost Army showed the same principle from the opposite direction. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was a classified American unit of approximately 1,100 men, activated in January 1944. Its entire purpose was to exploit the fact that the Germans were reading American unit markings as intelligence. If patches and vehicle symbols were being read as order of battle indicators, then false patches and false symbols could feed the Germans a false order of battle. The 23rd deployed to the European theatre in May 1944 and arrived in Normandy roughly 2 weeks after the landings. Over the following 10 months, it conducted 22 large-scale deceptions across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Its soldiers wore the patches of American divisions deployed elsewhere, drove conspicuously through towns where German observation was possible, and left visible traces of formations that did not exist in those sectors. They deployed inflatable tanks and dummy artillery pieces positioned to be spotted by German aerial reconnaissance. They broadcast recorded sounds of armored column movements through speakers mounted on half-tracks, making empty fields sound like staging areas. They transmitted fake radio traffic designed to simulate the communication patterns of real American formations, complete with authentic call signs and message formats that German signals analysts would recognize. The unit's most consequential single operation came in March 1945, when it helped conceal the exact location of the 9th United States Army's crossing of the Rhine in what was called Operation Viersen. By simulating the presence of American formations miles away from the actual crossing point, the 23rd helped the real operation go forward with less German resistance than the defenders might otherwise have mounted. Among the men in the 23rd were the fashion designer Bill Blass and the painter Ellsworth Kelly, recruited partly because creative sensibility translated into the visual demands of physical deception in ways that conventional military training did not produce. The unit's existence remained classified until 1996. In February 2022, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops received the Congressional Gold Medal for its contributions to the Allied victory in Europe. The Ghost Army's entire operational logic rested on one assumption, that the Germans were reading American unit markings the same way the Americans were reading German unit markings. The fact that the deceptions worked confirms the assumption was correct. By the spring of 1945, The Order of Battle Intelligence System was operating at the highest level of effectiveness it had reached in the entire war. The Order of Battle of the German Army had gone through 3 major editions, each one built on the accumulated intelligence of 2 more years of prisoner interrogations, Soldbuch exploitation, document analysis, aerial reconnaissance, and signals intelligence. The picture it presented of the German army by early 1945 was detailed, continuously updated, and operationally precise in ways its April 1943 first edition could not have been. What that document represented, across its 3 editions, was the cumulative product of tens of thousands of individual intelligence acts. Every prisoner interrogation, every captured Soldbuch, every examined vehicle emblem, every intercepted letter, every aerial photograph of a German position fed the picture. The analysts who maintained the document knew which German divisions had been destroyed and rebuilt, which had been split into battle groups to cover more front than their actual strength allowed, which were still capable of mounting a serious counterattack, and which were fighting on organizational inertia alone. The German formations being tracked by 1945 were themselves dramatically different from the army that had launched the invasions of France and the Soviet Union in 1940 and 1941. The original Wehrmacht had been an army of professional soldiers, well-equipped, well-trained, and ideologically motivated. By 1944 and 45, it was an army in increasing disintegration, with paper divisions that existed only in headquarters documents, formations made up of teenagers and elderly conscripts, and frontline units held together by fanaticism, discipline, and the practical impossibility of surrender for many of the men inside them. American intelligence was tracking that disintegration in real time, watching divisions that had once fielded 12 to 17,000 men shrink to battle groups of a few hundred, detecting the movements of formations in sectors where they had no business being, reading the signs that often predicted a German retreat or counterattack before the movement began. The patch readers and interrogators and analysts were part of all of it. Not the whole picture, never the whole picture, but a consistent and irreplaceable strand in the process of knowing. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The Ritchie Boys dispersed back into the civilian lives they had left. They had spent the war in small teams, doing work that almost no one outside a narrow circle of cleared officers fully understood. They had been told not to discuss it. Most of them complied, for decades. The story of what had been built at Camp Ritchie stayed out of the public record for 50 years. Veterans of infantry divisions, armoured formations, and airborne units wrote memoirs and gave interviews. The intelligence teams who had fed those formations, their picture of the enemy, stayed largely silent. Many Ritchie Boys joined no veterans organizations specific to their work. Some settled back into academic or professional careers and never mentioned the war's intelligence dimension at all. The full story remained classified until the 1990s. A German documentary, first released in 2004, drew on surviving members and newly available records to tell it for the first time in a broad public format. A 60 minutes segment in September 2021, expanded in January 2022, brought the story to a wide American audience. In April 2022, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum honored the Ritchie Boys with the Elie Wiesel Award, the museum's highest recognition, for their unique role in the Allied victory and for what their service represented. It took nearly 80 years for the full weight of that contribution to receive formal public acknowledgement. What remains when you step back from all of it is something that resists easy framing. This was not a story of dramatic action. There were no celebrated charges, no famous last stands, no names that became household words. It was a story of knowledge, systematically built and relentlessly applied to the problem of understanding an enemy in detail. The men who drove this system were not heroes in the conventional sense. They sat in farmhouses and field tents, and the back seats of jeeps, reading uniforms and asking careful questions, and writing their findings into reports that shaped the outcome of every major engagement on the Western Front. The institutional apparatus behind them was the most significant military intelligence system the United States had ever built, assembled in less than 3 years from essentially nothing. It did not announce itself. It did not make headlines. It worked in the background of every battle, feeding the picture that commanders depended on to make decisions. And it produced those decisions faster, and with more accuracy than German commanders facing the Americans on the other side of the line were receiving their own intelligence, partly because the patch readers and interrogators were operating at the immediate tactical level and feeding results up in hours rather than days. That speed mattered. In mobile warfare, a picture of the enemy that is 24 hours old can be worse than useless if the enemy has moved. The system Camp Ritchie built was designed to produce intelligence that was current, specific, and actionable, and it did. At the center of that system were men who had every personal reason to be broken by what the 20th century had already done to them. They had been expelled from their homeland. They had watched their families be persecuted, and in many cases, murdered. 2 of their colleagues had been identified as German Jews in American uniform and shot in the snow near the German border. And yet the remaining Ritchie boys kept working, kept reading, kept asking, kept filing the reports that helped bring the war to its end. The German commanders tried. Orders against cuff titles in forward areas were issued, then ignored or rescinded. Vehicle insignia were painted over, then repainted when the command and control problems became unworkable. Soldiers were told to give name, rank, and serial number only, and many did give only that. But the Soldbuch stayed in the tunic pockets where regulations required them, because removing the requirement would have broken the administrative machine that kept the army fed and paid and supplied. The cuff titles stayed on the sleeves where unit pride demanded them, because the regime had built those units on the premise that their identity was their strength. And the Waffenfarbe piping stayed on the collar tabs, where decades of military tradition had placed it, because the German army could not function without the internal legibility that those colors provided. The Americans had spent 3 years learning a language the Germans could not stop speaking, a language written in the color of collar piping, in the numbers on shoulder straps, in the words embroidered on a sleeve, and in the pages of a booklet that every German soldier was legally required to carry on his person at all times. That knowledge, quiet, methodical, and entirely unglamorous, helped win the war. The last survivors of the Ritchie Boys generation have grown old and most have passed on. The youngest would be in their late 90s today. What they built, what they demonstrated, and what they endured to make it work belongs now to the permanent record of the Second World War. It belongs to everyone who needs to understand how wars are actually decided, not only in the moment of battle, but in the patient, systematic, and unglamorous work of knowing the enemy before the shooting begins. It belongs to the memory of Werner Angres convincing a prisoner to walk his own minefield first. It belongs to Guy Stern arriving at the Norman shore and beginning to interrogate before he had found his billet. And it belongs, in particular, to the memory of Kurt Jacobs and Murray Zappler, who gave their lives not carrying a rifle or storming a position but doing exactly what they had been trained to do, reading the enemy, asking the right questions, in a language they had been born speaking, for a country that had taken them in when the country of their birth had tried to destroy them.